In Canberra, the newly sworn-in Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce will be preparing for a big question time coming up at 2 p.m. today. It'll, of course, be live here on Sky News. Plenty of people will be eagerly watching how his first QT goes back in the job. Let's bring in political consultant Jim Middleton for more analysis. Jim, it's back to the future for the Nationals with Barnaby Joyce sworn in this morning. How do you expect this is going to play out for the Nats and more broadly for the coalition?
Good afternoon to you, Ash. Look, it's a Hail Mary pass, really, on the part of the National Party. Look, there's no doubt that many members of the National Party room were concerned about the lack of cut-through, as it were, from Michael McCormack. But it is worth looking at a little bit of history here, which is if you go back to 2016, when Barnaby Joyce was Deputy Prime Minister, the National Party vote went backwards almost everywhere, whereas under Michael McCormack in 2019, it went up. Now, there are slightly different dynamics, of course, between those two elections. Labor did better than expected in 2016 and worse than expected in 2019. There was also Malcolm Turnbull rather than Scott Morrison as Prime Minister, which clearly made a difference. There's also, it would seem to me, there's in this really risky transition, there's a time limit to it. That is that Scott Morrison may be able to manage the issue, in particular on the question of climate change, up to the Glasgow summit, climate change summit in November. But beyond that, it becomes very, very difficult. There's little doubt in my mind that one of the reasons that the Prime Minister did not get a bilateral, a one-on-one meeting with President Biden in the UK a week or so ago was that Australia is not being as unequivocal as the Americans would like on the question of targets for net zero by 2050 and interim targets as well. So the Prime Minister may well be able to walk both sides of the street on this issue up to then, but after that it becomes much more difficult. Now, what does that say about the question of election timing? Well, maybe it makes it a bit more likely that there will be an election this year if the Prime Minister can manage the other parts of the problems that he faces, notably the vaccine rollout. There's also, Ash, the question of women. As we noted, Kay Hull, former National Party member and now President of the National Party, is acknowledging that there's a bit of division as far as that's concerned. Two members of the National Party room, Anne Webster and Michelle Landry, were suggesting ahead of yesterday's ballot that this could be a problem for Barnaby Joyce. He suggests that he's redeemed and improved himself. He does still have an unresolved sexual harassment case hanging over his head. He denies he's done anything wrong. But the question then becomes, how will women, and particularly women in the country, view the return of Barnaby Joyce? That's an open question. Back on the climate change issue, I think there are issues too for inner city urban Liberals. You'll notice, for example, that Katie Allen, the member for Higgins, has been pretty careful since she came into Parliament at the last election not to rock the boat, as it were, but she has made it clear on a number of occasions that as far as the voters in her leafy suburbs and the eastern suburbs of Melbourne are concerned, climate change is the number one issue. So this is going to be a question not just for the Nationals, with Barnaby Joyce back in harness, but also for the Liberal Party. I think the management issue for Scott Morrison has got more difficult, but it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that he can handle it between now and an election, if there is one this year. After that, I suspect it becomes more difficult.
Yeah, because Jim, as you point out, the management issue of the Nationals for Scott Morrison, there's the policy issues that you've just gone through there, but also the personality issues. I mean, Michael McCormack and Barnaby Joyce, like chalk and cheese. It will be a really different dynamic here for Scott Morrison.
Well, it's a very, very split party room, as we've seen when it's come to a ballot on past occasions. It's really riven right down the middle. And what made the difference, it appears, for Barnaby Joyce here was Matt Canavan, who was effectively his numbers man in this challenge, taking one for Team Barnaby by not insisting on returning to the front bench. So there were a couple of others whose votes were in doubt, Susan McDonald and Andrew Gee, it appears, may get elevated to ministerial positions. Never underestimate the power of ambition as far as leadership challenges. Doesn't matter which party it is, whether it's the Greens, the Labor Party, or indeed the Nationals or the Liberal Party. So that is what's made the difference. There's also the question of David Littleproud, who did stick with Michael McCormack, even though he's got rightful ambitions to the leadership. One wonders whether, despite all of that, because had he not made that commitment that if Michael McCormack stood that he wouldn't, I wonder whether the outcome might have been different. So I wonder whether he's on a bit of a promise too as far as Barnaby's concerned. That is whether it's Barnaby Joyce through to the next election, but beyond that, what happens then? So yes, but resolving these issues for the Nationals is facing the threats that they do in New South Wales in particular from the shooters, farmers and fishers, in Queensland from One Nation. Managing this is very, very difficult for them. There are a lot of farmers who do believe that climate change is real and want to see action taken on it. There are others, of course, who are equally firmly of the belief that there should be nothing done that costs them in any way, shape or form. Interesting too, Ash, to see what happens in terms of the coalition agreement. We do know that in the agreement struck between Malcolm Turnbull and Barnaby Joyce initially, that Malcolm Turnbull was very much hobbled in what he could do on climate change, on water and on gay marriage, for example, which goes some way to explaining why he behaved in the way in which he did as Prime Minister. Now, the argument will be interesting to see in terms of the coalition agreement, which we don't get to see. It's a confidential document, just exactly what has been hammered out there and what and how hard-line Barnaby Joyce has been, particularly on issues relating to climate and water. So a lot of things up in the air at the moment. Ash, it's not all one way. This is not necessarily a disaster for the Prime Minister and for the coalition, but it does make things much more difficult in the sense that Barnaby Joyce will be a harder taskmaster. He has crossed the floor in the past. He's threatened to do it from the backbench again. He's got differences over the Biloela family, for example. He thinks they should be returned to Biloela. The government, the higher echelons of the government do not. And there's also on issues even including the question of Julian Assange, where he's being different. It's going to be a fascinating ride. Fasten your seatbelts, Ash.
Certainly will, Jim Middleton. Appreciate your analysis. Thank you.